Shabbat Shalom. This week's Torah portion is Pekudei, and it's the final chapters of the book of Exodus, where we read about the erection of the tabernacle after all these chapters that we have been discussing, the details of how the tabernacle was constructed. And I'd like to focus this week on the final verses in this week's portion. We're at chapter 40, beginning with verse 34. And I'll read these first few verses. Then a cloud covered this is after the tent of meeting and the tabernacle has been erected. Then a cloud covered the appointed tent, and the glory of the Eternal filled the dwelling. And Moses was not able to come into the appointed tent, because the cloud abode thereon, and the glory of the Eternal filled the dwelling. And when the cloud was taken up from over the dwelling, the children of Israel journeyed in all their journeys. But if the cloud were not taken up, then they journeyed not till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Eternal was upon the dwelling by day, and fire was on it by night, in the eyes of all the house of Israel throughout all of their journeys. Now actually, these last few verses talk about two separate things, both of which, though, have to do with this very special cloud. The cloud that covers or that hovers above the tent of meeting, above the tabernacle. Clearly, the cloud here is a manifestation of God's presence. And so at the beginning of these verses, we read that at a time when the cloud is dwelling in or throughout the tabernacle, and the verse here talks about the glory of God filling the tabernacle, then Moses is not able to go into the tabernacle. The end of these verses talks about a different situation with the cloud. When the cloud rises from above the tabernacle, then it is a sign for the children of Israel to travel. And when the cloud rests on the tabernacle, it is a sign that the children of Israel will rest, that they will camp. And the last verse talks about the fact that throughout this entire time, when the children of Israel are in the desert, in the wilderness, and they're traveling, they will have this constant presence with them of both the cloud during the day, and the pillar of fire, or the fire at night. Now, these are actually two very different things that we're talking about. The beginning talks about the rules of entry, or at least it seems the rules of entry of Moses to the tent of meeting. And it seems with the erection of the tabernacle, we suddenly have new rules. Moses cannot just go and speak to God whenever he wants, but there are times when he is able to go into the tabernacle and speak to God, and there are times when he cannot. And this has to do with the glory of God, or this cloud covering in the tabernacle. Now, one of the commentaries that I read talks about the fact, well, if the glory of God, or if this cloud fills up the entire tabernacle, then how could Moses possibly come in? There would be no space for him. I have trouble with that commentary, because I don't think here we're talking about a physical presence, although clearly there is a physical cloud. There's no question that God himself doesn't have a physical presence, and therefore there isn't, while the whole idea of building a tabernacle in a way is a physical space where God can dwell, it is not something that is going to limit neither God's presence nor the ability of Moses to communicate with God. There's another interpretation that I actually like a lot better, and this interpretation says that when the cloud is on the tabernacle, Moses is not allowed to come into the tabernacle without being previously called. In other words, this is sort of a sign that says God is here, God is reigning in the tabernacle, and therefore it is not a place where even someone as great as Moses, can just freely go in and out at will. And this reminds me actually of, I think what this does is set up a paradigm of a king in his court, and when the king is in his palace, then there's a much greater degree of respect and formality that will reign there. And it reminds me actually of the story that we see in the book of Esther, when Esther relates to Mordecai the rules of the court, being that she is not allowed to go before the king, Ahasuerus, without being called. He has to pull out his scepter to call him. And indeed, that is a commentary about this whole incident as well. When the cloud is there, then Moses cannot go into the tabernacle without being called. Now, the very first verse of the next book, the beginning of Leviticus, begins with exactly that calling. And God calls out to Moses from the tent of meeting, from the tabernacle. And so basically we have on the one hand a restriction in Moses' ability to approach God, but on the other hand we have an immediate calling out to Moses. This new situation has been established, but God does not want that to be a break in his relationship with Moses. And the very next thing that happens is that God calls out to Moses and begins a very long series of teachings and instructions to Moses that we read about in the book of Leviticus. The last part of these verses, though, talks about the function of this cloud vis-a-vis the children of Israel. And here, the cloud functions as a signpost. You get up in the morning and the camp and the children of Israel, and they look around, and what are we doing today? And you look to the center of your camp, which is where the tabernacle stood, and you see where the cloud is. And based upon the cloud you're going to decide, do we have to pack up and move, or are we staying here another day? In a way, then, this is the counterpoint to what we read in the first few verses. If the first few verses, the cloud tells us something about a certain distance or a certain limitation in the relationship between man and God, in the second part of these verses, we read about an extra line of communication. Because through this cloud, which everybody sees, and we see that at the last few words of the book, where it says, "And to the eyes of all the house of Israel," every single person in that camp is able to see that cloud. And that cloud is a way that God chooses to communicate with the entire nation of Israel at once. And what is that communication? Well, first of all, it's a technical communication. It's about, are we traveling today, or are we staying in camp, which is very nice. But I think the most profound message, of course, is what we have in the last verse, that this cloud of God, together with the fire, are an everlasting presence among them throughout their travels. In other words, God is with you. God is with them. God is enabling the children of Israel in a very physical way to feel and see his presence, and to know that he is watching over them, even as they embark on these very challenging travels throughout the desert. Now, at this point in time, the travel should only be taking another few weeks before they go into the land of Israel. Of course, what happens afterwards, after they sin, we are going to see, of course, 40 years where they are in the wilderness. And certainly a period like that, of 40 years' time, to know that at all times you are seeing the cloud of God, the glory of God, and this pillar of fire at night, had to have been of great comfort to the children of Israel. Wouldn't all of us like to be able to see a cloud, to be able to see God's presence in a physical way before us? And perhaps our challenge today, of course, is to be able to see God, not in the cloud perhaps, but in our daily lives, and in the way God does direct this world, and to know that even as we go through the journey of life, we are able to see God and know that he is guiding us and that he is with us at all times. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom.